Good morning, everyone. Now, I want to go into a specific question today. It's that of holy reverence. It's something to do with what is actually the essence of liturgy. We're not engaged in anything human. We're handling something greater than ourselves. And already we see it in the parable of the publican versus the Pharisee. We can come into liturgy in the mode of the Pharisee and, as it were, perform. We can be praying to ourselves, and we can be saying to Almighty God, "O Lord, how great I am, and to prove it I want all the attention of those looking at me. I'm going to use the liturgy as a great podium to get a round of applause, and I'm going to be shining brightly in the limelight. It's about me." The other mode is that of the publican. Doesn't even dare to raise his eyes to heaven, and he has a good thump on his breast looking down. "Lord, I'm not great shakes." Now he is told that he has actually been justified far more than the other. And what category are we in? So, nothingness is the true state of the creature. Remember now, the fall of Satan was essentially the appropriation of his gifts. He had gifts, but he started to own them. Non serviam, I will not serve. And liturgy gone mad is that. I will not serve. I will use liturgy to worship myself. It's a form of the original sin of the demons. And yea or nay, is it around in our churches right now? How many people come out of church having met much of man and very little of Jesus Christ, King of glory, whose glory has been well filched? So, I want to quote here a verse which jumped out of the page this morning. I have here a Bible which I picked up in the Holy Land, and it stands between the praying hands of Dura there, carved in olive wood, and the print of the words of our Lord are in red, and so they jump out of the page, and it makes great feeding for the soul in Lectio Divina in quiet moments before the Blessed Sacrament, especially in the hours of night or dawn. And it was this passage where the Master was sending rounds of servants to gain the fruits of what had been handed over to these husbandmen, these workers. So they have a rough time. They come back bruised and beaten, covered in elastoplast. And then he has this brainwave, "I will send my son. They will reverence him." That's the old translation. Him they will reverence. So I want to look at this question of reverencing the Son of God in our liturgy. Reverence comes from the Latin fear, and it's redoubled by the re in front of it. Vereor is the state of a person who is venerando. He's actually in a state of holy trembling before something awful. The word awful doesn't mean awful, but it means something that inspires awe. Therefore, that is the immediate attitude of the soul coming into church. I remember picking that up some time ago in the diary of St. Faustina. She puts in her diary how she was going on pilgrimage somewhere, and she happened to walk into a church which she'd never seen before, and whoomph, she was hit between the eyes by the awesomeness of this church. And she heard in her heart the Lord saying, "This is how I want it." And he wants this awesomeness to be felt in a place which is his. So what does that say to us in our time? There is one particular case which is of some interest in that, in the Catholic world. It's the case of a church which the Lord himself designed. Anyone know who it is, which it is? Well, it's the one in Bethlehem. The Lord wanted a church in Bethlehem where only prayer was going on, and he chose a soul who died eventually very young at the age of 32, who is now saint. It's only recently actually, but she was already blessed in the mid-80s from around about 1983 onwards, but now she is a saint, and she was a mystic who had very spectacular gifts, even though she was humility itself. She couldn't actually even write, and she wasn't even a choir nun. She was a lay sister, the conversa, those who wore the white veil, and she was responsible for many things because the Lord would do things through her. She would call herself le petit rien, the little nothing. She had all the gifts, including stigmata, and she was the one that was to be instrumental in having a Carmelite monastery built there in Bethlehem, the Lord's own city. And he was to be the architect of this monastery. So he drew up plans, and he was the one who had it exactly as he wanted it, and also he was fairly keen on having the life lived in there as he wanted it. And he was not amused when things weren't done according to the holy rule. So anyway, the plans were his, and so it's a very interesting case. It's a case study. What does the Lord like? First of all the windows in the monastery look not at the beautiful trees and greens and things that go around causing distraction, but they all the windows looked upwards to the skies. Now, sky and heaven is the same word in both Latin and Greek, uranos and caelum. So here we are, the Lord pointing upwards, even physically, and not wanting distraction. What does that tell us about we ourselves who spend time on the internet, not looking upwards, but looking into the cybersphere for hours on end? Contemplative, eh? And then he also indicated what was pleasing, at least in the case of these Carmelite nuns, with regard to the building itself. It's a noble simplicity in which the eye is directed to him. So he wants to reign. It is interesting that these intuitions also were given by the Holy Spirit to saints along the ages. We have, for instance, the Cistercian reaction there when they wanted the beauty of movement in the architectural lines. They wanted power in the drawing of the gaze towards focal points. The Lord was to be the centre of attention and not to be, as it were, multiplied in several directions of attention. And so great simplicity, but noble dignity. Not a box, but a movement, even in the architecture. Movement to him. He is Lord, and that has to be felt and seen when we come into the house of the Lord. And so, already the choice to let him reign or not reign is ours when we go in there. What do? Do we carry on what we left off? Do we start to catch up on the messages on the mobile phone? Do we have a good chat about the weather and the football match, which is very important, of course? Or do we fall down before the King of Glory and give him space? Now, space in that case is silence. Silence is his sacred space. So already that's our choice, whether we let him reign or not, when we come into the house of God. And that's the first instance whether we are reverencing him or not. Because at that point, the scale of duties changes. The same obligation to reverence our brethren in the same way as outside is not the same at that point. We are actually out of order if we carry on the same mode, and that's where people get confused. They think the same rules apply inside as outside, and therefore all the rules of natural courtesy apply with regard to engaging in conversation at the same tone and the same volume as the person. No! It's not the same. At that point, we honor Jesus together, and he's not honoring our banality at that point if we make it an agora, a place of meeting for ourselves. It's his place, and he won't bless us if we use it for the wrong purpose. So already the architecture does help. The other day, I had a priest guest here. He was actually on a quiet retreat there, an Norbertine, a good man, and we went to Compline in a nearby monastery. Actually, we went to Vespers at one monastery on the Friday, and we went to another monastery nearby. There were all two of them nearby, different orders. And as Compline as it was, I wasn't expecting that because the Cistercians are very simple. But when we went in, wow! The place was dense with fog. I mean, incense. You wouldn't expect that in a Cistercian monastery, but there it was. It was the real thing. And that immediately put us in prayer mode. So we switched off everything else and got into prayer mode for about 3/4 of an hour. It was enough to be with Jesus. And it was Cistercian in that sense that the eyes were orientated not towards a huge army of statues walking around, but towards one point, the tabernacle, still as a tabernacle, the very same one in the middle with a veil over it, a big one with a light there. But it was all geographically and architecturally orientated towards him alone. And so the eyes there fell where they were meant to fall, and nothing took them away. So it was enough to be on our knees, just there, for 3/4 of an hour, in the place where the pong in the air helped us greatly. So these things matter. We're not going into a Protestant assembly hall. We're not going into a place of noise, but a place where angels are flittering around. We're in the company of angels. Indeed, in the monastery where I was formed for a long time in France, we had angels carved, angel wings carved beside us and on top of us on the choir stalls. And the novice master explained to us, it is to remind us that we are singing in the presence of the angels. So they're there, hovering around, hovering around, hovering around. And by the way, do you know that St. Bernard was shown things, and he saw how in some cases the angels had lots and lots and lots of baggage to carry up with them when they were carrying up the prayers of the monks. In others they had a fairly light baggage, in others none at all. It was all to do with the level of engagement. So engagement, that's our bit, and that's how we reverence the Lord, because the Lord wants worship in spirit and in truth. So let's get this straight. Liturgy is not about creating effects for man, but about engaging between the deepest level of the soul and its God. And the liturgy is the atmosphere created in which that may happen. It is not to be its own centre of attention, but the vehicle that carries us to God. It's about God and not about liturgy in itself, as though it were a self-centred thing. Liturgy is a handmaid, and God is the one worshipped, not liturgy itself. Otherwise we fall into the error traditionally called rubricism. It's a ritualism where actually the centre of attention is the rite, the ritual. It's all to do about the number of degrees about which you are inclined to perform at. I mean to say that it was very precise in days of old, and it led to an extreme, which was that of being so distracted to get it right that one didn't actually engage. That was the wrong end of things. But in reaction, we've got to the other end of things, which is actually laziness, and nothing matters. It's a free-for-all. It's a happy balance that we need. It's not either or, but a good, healthy blend of both and. But the bottom line is this: are we adoring God? Are we engaging with God or not? Is he being honoured or are we? That we can't get over, and we can't in any way make up for what is lacking on the level of the interior. I remember reading this one time, one of the books we were given in formation there in France. It was about the renewal and liturgy, and it was a very strong thesis in this book, coming to this crunch at the end. No matter how much we do in the realm of renewal, on any level whatsoever of liturgy, of good working upon it, if the heart is not in prayer, it is not successful. In other words, that's the only thing that in the long run really is the test. Is it helping us to engage? Is it a place where engagement is taking place? Otherwise, we're fooling ourselves, and the Lord is not being honoured. So, I leave it there for a few seconds, because I want to develop this in a specific area. So, I'll come back in a few seconds. Now, with regard to this issue, the creation of something which honours God is something which is partly human, but also partly pneumatic. Pneumatic comes from the word pneuma, spirit. And our liturgy has to be spirit-filled. Spirit-filled as the Lord wants, worship in spirit and in truth. It has to have a soul. Now, it has been picked up by those who are analysing what was fitting in the interpretation of the invitation of the Vatican to be open to what was best in the culture of a country that the Church was evangelizing, what we have come accustomed to calling inculturation, because this has been used as a lever to also apply it to situations of modern culture in the West, and that sometimes to an excess in such a way that the natural, ancient, already sanctified and spirit-filled sacred culture that we have has been regarded as no longer sacred and no longer valuable, in favour of something which is of a certain type only. And if you don't believe what I'm saying, look around. What is actually the norm now in church music, for instance? So this has been picked up by those who are analysing the problem. It's a profound problem. First of all, there is the virtual denial of even the adjustments that were going on quite a lot even before the Second Vatican Council in regard to their profound value, because we forget that the liturgical movement was very much at work for a long time before actually liturgy itself was altered, and therefore intuitions were given, but they were gentle and they were in this mode of continuity. A big moment was the work of Pius XII in the publication of Mediator Dei in 1947, and also the reforming of the Holy Week liturgy in 1955. And those already were indicating the way that things would go, and they're powerful intuitions. We forget, for instance, that already in 1947, Pius XII was quite clear that there should be a continuity between the consecration and the communion. There should be hosts received from the Mass itself that were given to the people of God, at least some of them. And this was forgotten very quickly. And one sees even now in many of our celebrations, often actually to facilitate a certain understanding of participation, an automatic going into the tabernacle and the multiplication of points of distribution even on a weekday when there's no need at all, so that the average lay person, the super lay person, can be seen to be important and having to help even when there's no need whatsoever to help. You know what I mean? Well, actually, it's an incorrect understanding of the dynamic of the Last Supper. The Lord said, "Take, eat this." He was holding it. This is my body. And that should be seen in our celebrations, that what is consecrated should be given by the hand who is actually there consecrating. There's no need to be multiplying the points of distribution on a weekday. It takes away from the unity of the sign. One bread, one chalice. And that should be seen physically. Indeed, in monasteries in Italy and in France, we tended always, if possible, to use one large host for everyone on a weekday. An enormous host, for everyone on a weekday. And it shows the continuity. It shows what is meant by sharing, even physically. Now, therefore, these were already intuitions given, and also in Musica Sacra, and lots of documents coming out over the years, already actually as early as Pius X, who was a pastor of souls, even way before he was made a bishop. He was somebody who knew what worked on parish level. Well, these documents were important because they were giving lights from the Holy Spirit as to what the Lord was trying to do in his own house. And they were often just jettisoned as though nothing that had happened before the Second Vatican Council was of value anymore. Well, these are of great value. Now, let's just look at one or two issues here concerning this pivotal issue. Yes, because what was going on was this. People were caricaturing all that was pre-Vatican II, and that's around even now. People label anything vaguely pre-Vatican II as just outmoded. Well, it's a very imbalanced and superficial understanding of sacred history. The Holy Spirit is the same Spirit, and he's outside time, and he's known how to form saints well before us, and we've got nothing coming if we think we're the first to get it right, as though we're the only ones who knew how to pray. So, generalizations of previous liturgical practices. For example, priests whose voices could barely be heard in the church during Mass, or who advised people to receive communion before. But that used to happen. You see, before, that used to happen in some places, that the people would be encouraged to receive Holy Communion outside Mass, e.g., it was a practice in some places to have Holy Communion very early in the morning, even on a Sunday, and then people would come back for the full Mass in the middle of the morning. It was a liturgical aberration, but it was around in some places, because of the rule of fasting from midnight. Anyway, clearly indicate less than perfect models of liturgical celebration, as does actually the practice of reciting the Rosary during Mass itself. That was around. Even in some places, they would actually give out the Rosary in Mass itself on a weekday. That would happen in Ireland quite a bit, I understand. I heard that on the grapevine. But anyway, these things then were held up as it were, things that showed how little people understood of liturgy, and therefore they became the point of reaction as though the whole of what went before was in the same vein. Well, that's not the case at all. In fact, one can ask whether actually genuinely people now in the pew know more about genuine reverence and prayer than those who went before us, even though they might not have been doing the exact correct thing when they were in church as regards understanding what was going on. They were actually praying, and that is the essence of liturgy after all. So we can't be so proud to think we're the first to start praying with regard to our approach to liturgy. It's just presumption and pride. So, in fact, Pope Benedict did point that out in his encouraging of the availability of the Old Mass again. He was saying quite clearly that what has been sacred for 2 millennia cannot be suddenly regarded as non-sacred. We make fun of the most sacred thing of all, as though we're grown up at last. So, what is being pointed out here is that to make a caricature of certain elements of what went before is typical of the person who has no culture, and therefore is not the correct approach to true liturgical awareness. Now, the truth is this: by almost presenting these practices as the state of affairs before the reforms which followed the Second Vatican Council, this approach is actually to ignore completely the valuable achievements of the liturgical movement. That is, this calm, organic movement within the old, already leading up to the Second Vatican Council. And this was endorsed by the magisterium itself, cautiously, but it was encouraged. For instance, we see already in 1955 the way that things were going by the way that the obligation for the priest to say privately what was being chanted or said elsewhere in church was taken away. Because remember, what was going on was this. For instance, if you have the solemn mass as it was done before, the high mass now, before there had been the obligation for the priest to say as well what the subdeacon or deacon would be chanting elsewhere, and what the choir would be saying elsewhere. So in practice you had this going on. You had, as it were, the outside, the chanting, the singing, the polyphony, all the Gregorian chant, all this going on, and the celebrant in dialogue with those next to him at the altar, muttering the same things as well in a sotto voce tone, that is, not audible by the people. So, as it were, two celebrations going on at the same time. Now, that was going to lead to a very strong reaction, you see, after the Vatican Council. But it was to caricature things and forget also that this was a problem of which the experts were already aware. They were discussing it big time. And already Pius XII in 1955 was getting into that clearing of this business up by taking away that obligation in the reform of the Holy Week services, which we're still using, by the way, more or less now, unchanged. That was already happened way before the Council, and the first stage in which the way things were going to go was already clear from that point there, where there was a clearing up of things and a making meaningful of everything that was to happen. Therefore, this doubling up already at that point was taken away. Under the calm guidance of the Holy Spirit, who is not a spirit of violence, but of serenity, in organic growth and continuity. What Benedict XVI calls the hermeneutic of continuity, precisely. Now, so these were also apparent before Vatican II, and the experience and sound liturgical piety of many ordinary people, because even before the Second Vatican Council, in places where the pastors were, should we say, enlightened and aware, they were already encouraging the people to purchase a missal, and not to be praying their private devotions at that point, but to be praying the Mass itself. That is to say, to be aware of what the priest was saying, and to be praying it in their own language from the book at the same time. That was already coming in. It didn't come into Ireland. The things didn't just, it wasn't in Ireland, it's not a liturgical situation. People, out of force of habit, have always prayed in a devotional way, and that is still there in Ireland to this day. But in countries where people were more aware of liturgical issues, it was already being encouraged. Germany, France, Switzerland, even America, even before the Second Vatican Council. Just to be aware, that is already participation, participatio actuosa, active participation on the level of the spirit and the mind. There's engagement with what is going on, and not just private devotions. That was already taking place in some places now, way before the council itself. So, ordinary people, therefore, could have access to this. And actually in Ireland too, lots of people did have a missal. One sees them around. They come back to the surface now when one is celebrating in the old rite, because people find them in their grandmother's books, for instance. They would be given as confirmation presents, for instance. They were around, and they did have the two languages in them, so people could actually follow the readings. And by the way, Pope Benedict, in his autobiography, talks about the way in which the German missal that he had, it's Scott, it's called, he would read that very much when he was growing up, and the commentaries in it and the meditations in it, the way it was in two languages, it was a great help to him. He was already fully aware of liturgy way before anything with regard to the Vatican Council, because he was growing up in it in a country where they were aware of it. In Germany they were, way back. So, sound liturgical piety of many ordinary people, and the liturgy in the lives of the saints, because how many saints have been formed and sanctified by these? Because the same things sanctify in the same way. And by the way, I've noticed on a Sunday that in celebrating in the old rite there publicly, once a week, or sometimes twice, depends if it's a feast or First Friday, but especially on a Sunday when not many people are there, but they're people, a lot of them are very young in age, and a lot of them wouldn't necessarily be particularly Latin inclined, but they want to pray. They come to a place where there's no talking, where it's purely vertical, and there's no abuse, and they come back for more, because the same grace has the same effect. God is the one met, and not man. And they're just ordinary people, and I say, a lot of them young, and you might find them also in a charismatic assembly afterwards in some other context. In other words, it's not either or, but both and. It's the same Spirit of God. Authenticity is what we want, not gimmicks. And authenticity is to be found also in what is older than us. Now, so, remembering therefore that these liturgical encounters have formed saints, and many people before us have been moved. I remember when I was a young man going to see a lady who had actually become a Catholic. She had been a Methodist, good Welsh lady, and she was in our parish in Cardiff, and she showed me her old missal. And she would take this with her to church even before the Second Vatican Council, and it was the old rite, obviously, and she showed me then how it changed colour when it came to the Eucharistic prayer, the old canon. And I was wondering, what's all this about? Well, yes, it had been fingered and therefore got yellow with sweat, but also she explained how it had actually changed in texture and colour at these pages. She just put it simply this way: it was the gift of tears. The gift of tears. Was she praying, or was she behind the times? Question mark. The gift of tears. There used to be a mass for the gift of tears way back. Pro dono lacrimarum, a votive mass. But then she rounded up her little commentary with one simple phrase. And she left it at that. It was this: we don't get it now. We forget these were the hidden saints, the hidden gems, and we think we've got it better because we make a lot of noise and we draw a lot of applause. Question mark. Who got it right? So, the sound liturgical piety of many ordinary people, which puts matters in a broader theological and historical perspective. Again, the person of culture is a person who knows both sides of the story. When I was a student, we had to do in philosophy an essay on the thought of John Stuart Mill, one of the philosophers in England. And there was a quote. It was, "Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, for Socrates knows both sides of the story." The liturgical fidget who is interested in creating something new each time is only content when he is dissatisfied, criticizing and throwing tomatoes at people who went before him. The liturgical, cultivated, complete person is uncomfortable in the superficial because he knows both sides of the story. Who is the true liturgist of those two? I remember hearing this one time. The difference between a liturgist and a terrorist is that one can negotiate with a terrorist. While one should be conscious of a constant need for liturgical education of clergy and laity in the Church, the necessity for a radical reform, in inverted commas, and radical in italics, of the liturgy as a response to possible liturgical deficiencies, in inverted commas again, that is, the things of the past that weren't actually complete, has surely proved to be a significant problem and not the answer. In other words, it's from people who don't see all the elements in a problem. Things are not simplistic, and to make them simplistic is to show how little we know. It would also be wrong to view entirely those individuals who attend old rite masses as regressionists during a wholesale return to the 1950s or the Middle Ages. Yet, generally speaking, both periods in history made a very positive contribution to the development of the liturgy. For instance, one thinks of the introduction of Corpus Christi in the Middle Ages, or again of what I pointed out with regard to the 1950s. So, there is this question of also being very hospitable to what is best in a local culture. The Vatican Council was aware of this because it was the first truly worldwide council in history, because the Council of the First Vatican Council was fairly restricted to certain parts of the world compared to the second one, because we had all the bishops of the world geographically there. In the second one, it was much bigger. And the impetus then to be aware of this block of new Catholic countries was there, and therefore to take on board the best of that. So people were being encouraged to respect what was truly noble in a local culture. And then the problem was that that was extended also to what was usable, in inverted commas, in our modern Western culture. But then it led to the forgetting that actually in our own culture in the West, the cradle of things as we have them in antiquity, we had what was natural to us and natural in its nobility, but it wasn't good enough. We had to have something which was only incultured in something ultra-modern. So that's what we're at right now in many of our celebrations, and the truly noble has just been thrown through the window because it's too much to do, and also it excludes some in the congregation. So it is a problem. I want to go into another question after another little short break, because I want to look again at one issue regarding the East, because it has something to tell us on this point. Back in a few seconds. Pope Benedict wasn't shy to indicate the way in which he saw the liturgy as the centre of the life of the Church, and the very point which determines the quality of our spiritual life, because it is the point where we encounter regularly heaven, and therefore the way we handle it is the way we're handling our God and the space we're giving to him. And he was criticised for the amount that he would actually write on liturgical questions, because his critics would say he is not a liturgist. And he calmly replied in print, "Liturgy is too important to be entrusted to experts." And his thought, and he made it quite clear, was this, that to have the mentality of being in control of liturgy in such a way that one could fabricate it ex nihilo from nothing is a rupture in the very thought pattern of the church. The church receives, the church hands on, and therefore his whole thrust was that anything that happened with regard to adapting liturgy to our time had to be in profound awareness and continuity of what had gone before. And that, as I say, is what we see when we look over our shoulder. And the Pope, as Pope Benedict, as well as his predecessor, John Paul II, and right now, as well as Pope Francis, was keen on recuperating this element, because without it, we are in danger of not being balanced. We're functioning with one lung, and we need to have that stabilizing effect of the massive East if we're going to keep our balance. Otherwise, we're just pulled too easily towards more of the West. I mean Protestants who've come out of us. Now, therefore, I want to address one issue. It's the question of humility, because worship in spirit and in truth is the very opposite of the non serviam, I will not serve, I will not obey, of the demon. And therefore, to be so independent as not even to obey the rubrics is not to understand in the minimum degree what we're actually doing when we're in true liturgy. We're disappearing before the rights of the king, and his rights are expressed in the will of the church. We can't please God and disobey him in church. Therefore, it matters that we know and that we study the general instruction of the Roman Missal, as we have it now, very clear. When applied, when obeyed, it creates good liturgy. When disobeyed, it withdraws God's blessing, partly, and we just don't succeed in what we're trying to do, because we're not praising God. We're in some way usurping his throne. We're using it as a podium for ourselves. Now, all that to say that, therefore, the balance can be found in the East, whether it's in the Eastern Rite churches belonging to us, because there are quite a few, or those who are just under the Eastern Patriarchs. But we mustn't forget those many churches that are also under Rome. The Ukraine has suffered a lot, and other parts too, such as parts of Romania, for wanting to be faithful. Those who are Eastern Rite Catholics, sometimes they were obliged by the authorities before, under communism, to go into the Eastern Orthodox bloc altogether against their wishes, but many were faithful. Anyway, therefore it's our own heritage too. And remember, the church was never divided before 1054. It was always the one church. Now, therefore, what do we find there? Humility. We find that the language of the humble is silence. Noise is the language of the proud. Hell is full of noise. A person who can't stop talking without being aware of it is actually proud, because he wants to reign over others. He will not abdicate or give space. I am visible. I am audible. I reign over this group of people by letting them hear my glorious voice. I have my truth, and my truth will reign. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Well, something of that also enters into our liturgy, if we're not careful. A noisy person is a person who can't stop talking, whether or not he raises his voice. A talkative celebrant, a person who by nature is a great talker, will carry more of the same thing into the church that he's trying to guide towards God in the way he celebrates. He'll have a word here and there. He won't have a moment's silence. He'll carry on his running commentary right through the celebration, an unstoppable flow of words. Well, it's a form of pride. I am audible. I am visible. Oh Lord, how great I am. A DJ, and not a Mr. Gog. Mr. Gog means somebody who draws agogain, who leads into mystery. And therefore, the true priest is a Mr. Gog. He is drawing them into a cloud of glory. So what happens in the East is this. One comes into church and one ceases to be. And one does not exist for the next 3 hours. One is lost in an intimate encounter, in a succession of suggestions of the ineffable, with what one is trying to feel out for. It's so great, one cannot utter it. And so a spirit-filled poetry is there with a multiplication of maximal adjectives, which suggests that we're approaching something as near as we possibly can. The burning bush is there, and we're just shedding everything in fear and trembling. In Latin, mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery that is tremendous, that is causing fear and trembling, and fascinating. One is happy to be there. One time I was in Romania, and I was talking to a priest of the community of Saint-Jean l'Evangeliste. It's a French community, they call them the Petit Gris, the little grey ones. They have a contemplative life, but they're also active. They're very good, and a lot of study, they're very good. And he was there ministering in Bucharest, but he was with us in a convent I was ministering to for a while, a contemplative convent in Romania, in the Archdiocese of Bucharest. And we were talking for a while because he was staying with us, and we got talking about different things in the liturgical life here and there, both in France and in Romania. And he came out with this, that one day he'd got to know an archimand right there in Romania, that's an abbot, and he died, this abbot, and so he was invited to the funeral in the monastery. So off he went with himself, and he simply said in French, 4 heures, 4 hours. So 4 hours of liturgy. But then he explained the effect that 4 heures, 4 hours of liturgy had on the soul. And he also explained how the real pure Orthodox tradition in iconography and all that went with it, because they have powerful monasteries there still in Romania, going right back, was something which was to be respected. It was a body, un tout qui tient, a whole that holds, and it had its transmission value. It had not been tampered with. And so he was explaining that when it came to the difference, for instance, and sometimes our own imitations there with iconography, it wasn't the same depth. He made a casual remark with regard to something more close to cartoons than iconography sometimes. But anyway, with regard to this issue of the effect of long liturgy, he put it this way: esichia. Greek, that is Greek for silence, but it's more than silence, the monastic thing. It's the whole silent atmosphere. It's the stilling, the silencing, the calming, the tranquilizing of all the levels of the person, starting with the body, because everything is peaceful, carried on by chant, and then pervading over a long period all the depths of the soul. So what happens? One also ceases to create too much thought. One starts to receive. One starts to be open to receive the thoughts of another. One is touched by the word. One is touched by the chant. A word comes out of the liturgy, and God, who is a God of stillness, can at last whisper, because he's found us available. In our Western short liturgy, we have liturgical snacks, often of the McDonald's variety, and therefore keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, and we're close to the end, and we've finished. We have got to the end, which is the main object of the exercise. We've got to the end. Now, how much has gone on in the meantime? If we're kind of aware of the clock. In fact, Pope Francis did mention this recently, that we should not be watching our watch in the liturgy. It's not the place for timing God. And therefore, this gratuitousness of lots and lots of time is important. I remember in the Holy Land, when I was there last time, I was moved because I had not booked to be one of the 3 available concelebrants for the Mass on a Thursday, the High Mass, the Latin one, in the place of the birth of the Lord. Because there are 2 altars there, the Greeks have one, and the Latins have the other. And on a Thursday, there is the weekly High Mass there, on the Latin one there, in the crypt of the place where the Lord was born, in Bethlehem. But there's only room for 3. And I wasn't one of the 3 booked. But fair play, I was quite touched, because one of the local priests, who would have been the 3rd, when he heard that there was a priest from another country, just calmly said, "Oh, you take my place," and so I was able to. But I was very moved by the antiquity of the status quo. That is what they refer to when they're talking about the way that things are kept in balance between the different rites down there. And it's written in ancient tradition there that it happens like this, that the Latin Mass on a Thursday is to start when the Greeks have finished. It's just as simple as that, when the Greeks have finished. And that means, therefore, they're vested and they're waiting sort of half an hour, it'd be very elastic, because given that they're handling liturgy of 3 hours long each time in the East, it's very elastic when it finishes. It could be a quarter of an hour before or a quarter of an hour after the dot. We work on the dot. They work on the elasticity of the Holy Spirit. And so they're waiting for a long time until they actually finish, because they start finishing, and then they have more bits, and then they finish, and then they finally finish. And then we start. But then it was interesting, because you see, there one was seeing the centuries. That's how it's always been there, and it works. It always has worked, and that's why they keep it the status quo. But it was seeing how the mentalities were different, and they respected each other, and it worked because of that. It was genuine prayer, and we were calm in the sacristy, praying away while that happened. And we went to do an incense-filled presepium. It was wonderful, but was also in union with the centuries, and time just didn't enter into it. So this element of having an awareness of the notion of sacred time is important. Authentic liturgy is outside time. And now I've got to the end of my time, so I better stop. So, okay then, I'll see you next time, and have a good time in the meantime. So have plenty of time for the timeless. God bless.